You're listening to the Book Talk Today podcast, a podcast that inspires readers to obtain valuable insights to inform, educate, and improve lives. My name is Abdi. I'm an avid reader, best known for the creation of the 1 Minute Book Review community, and I'm sitting down with authors to delve deeper into the books they have written to uncover the story behind the story. Hello Book Talk Today family, and welcome back to another episode of the Book Talk Today podcast. My name is Orn, and on today's podcast we are joined by Andrew Hankinson. Andrew is a writer based out of Newcastle upon Tyne in northern England. He's written for many different publications including Wired, The New Yorker and the BBC, and has reported from places such as Haiti, Iraq and Ukraine. He's written 2 books, the second of which is our topic of discussion today, Don't Applaud, Either Laugh or Don't, at the Comedy Cellar. We had an interesting conversation regarding the scene and some of the key individuals, both the owner and comedians based out of the Comedy Cellar in New York. We talked about some of the issues regarding comedians and free speech, what comedians can and can't say, and do they have free reign to say whatever they want. It was an interesting discussion about the role of comedy in today's world, and also a discussion around free speech and what you can and can't say and how that might come back and bite you later on down the line. It was a great conversation and one that I'm really looking forward to share with all of you. Thanks again for tuning into this podcast. If you haven't subscribed already, please do subscribe to the podcast. Each week we release a podcast with an author to discuss their book and the ideas and principles inside of them. So whether you're listening to this on YouTube, Spotify or Apple, please do follow and leave a rating as well if you can for the rankings. Without further ado, here is the podcast with Andrew. Enjoy. Andrew, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. And this idea of the world of comedy, it's a very new one for me. I haven't read much about it, but I have seen stuff on the news in regards to comedy and freedom of speech and what does it mean for the relationship between what is a comedian, what are they allowed to say, what are they not allowed to say. And I thought your book was an interesting look into the world of comedy and the world surrounding comedy. So I think before we get into some of the topics that you discussed in the book and some topics that I want to discuss, I think it'd be great to just give an introduction into how you became interested in this topic and some of the key themes that you learned when researching this.
I write for magazines, or I used to. I don't really do much of it anymore. But I used to write for magazines. I was always looking for story ideas. Louis C.K., the comedian, I read an article about him, which was in British Esquire, and I thought he was interesting. So I started kind of following along with what he was doing and stuff. And then from following his interviews and also some of the comedians that he talked about, I got interested in this comedy club, which is the comedy club that it was like his home club and he always played there, called the Comedy Cellar. I just found it quite interesting. I particularly found the owner of it interesting because of the things that he was saying. He was making these arguments for kind of free speech and stuff, and he was doing it in an intelligent way. I found him interesting. And then, so the first thing was I just pitched a profile of the club to some magazines. An in-flight magazine commissioned it, British Airways magazine. They said, yeah, go over and, but they said they wanted me to go and do stand-up there. So I did go and do like 5 minutes of stand-up there, wrote an article about that. And from then on, I kind of just always had an eye on these comedians, this group of comedians and the owner. And I've written a few articles about them in various places. And I just thought, this could make quite an interesting book about this argument about who decides what people can say and what they can't say, who decides who gets to have a platform, who doesn't get to have a platform. I thought it was like this setting where Noam, Dorman, the owner of this comedy club, was making these really strong, principled arguments about free speech, as awkward as it became in certain situations, talking just about speech there. He was making these really strong arguments. I just thought that was really interesting. And then watching some of the audience members react in a way that they did not want these things to be said on the stage and were quite angry about it. And it's like, how do you decide, what is okay and what is not okay? And I thought this particular room, we have a room where we can actually watch this debate happening. I thought that was an interesting way to look at it. So that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah, it definitely is. How did your 5 minutes of stand-up go? Was that the first time you ever did stand-up?
Yeah, it's the first and only time. I'll never do it again. So I really didn't want to do it. it's never appealed to me to do stand up. I'm not a good public speaker or anything. That's why I write as opposed to doing anything else. But they said when I pitched the idea, they said, well, we'd actually like a celebrity to go over there and do stand up. And I said, no, I really want to write about this place. And they were going to give me some money for the idea, and then send a celebrity. And I said, no, I really want to write about this place. So I don't want your money for the idea, and I'll just keep the idea. And then they said, well, okay, you go over there and do stand up. So I said, okay. And it was kind of, go to New York for 5 days or whatever, stay in nice hotels because it was British Airways, so they could get me nice hotels. But the whole trip was just ruined by the anxiety of having to do stand up on more or less the last night, I think it was. Because it's just horrific, like getting up there and having to make people laugh. And it wasn't like in one of their big shows. It was like in this show for kind of comedians who are learning, and they do like kind of they do some classes there. And at the end of the semester sort of thing, they do like a performance where all the students. So it was that I was taking part in. So it was like there was an expectation that these guys weren't going to be that good. But yeah, I mean, it went. That's the ludicrous thing is. People laughed and kind of liked it, and it was quite good because I worked really hard on writing these jokes. I just can't present them. The comedians have got this. Good comedians have got this amazing thing where they've got this charisma and kind of just there's something. As soon as they get up on the stage, there's something good about them. Whereas I don't have that at all. So I just had to write really, really what I thought were good jokes. So that saved me, and people knew I was doing it for a magazine, so they were kind of sympathetic to me and kind to me.
Yeah, they were polite to you. They were polite to you. This guy's just a writer; he's not a comedian. Now, I was going to say, what was your approach to writing the jokes? Because obviously you're a writer, but you write for a magazine. But how does it differ writing a joke to actually writing for a magazine?
So at that time, in most of my features, anyway, I always tried to kind of have some jokes. I wrote lots of short, funny things for like men's magazines and stuff. Like I literally, a back page in one of the men's magazines would be like 15 different kind of like, I can't even remember what they were, but daft little bits of writing. So I was used to you had to have punchline and then tagline in all these things to make them funny anyway. So I was used to writing that stuff. So that's what I did. My approach to it was just, so when I arrived in America, that's when I started writing some stuff on the plane. But then when I arrived in America for this 4 or 5 day trip, I was like just making notes in my notebook the whole time of like little observations that I'd made when I arrived in New York and what I thought would be funny. And then I just gradually reduced. I've kept the best ones and then just reduced them down onto little cards. I've just made little cards. And every day and night, I was just going through these, just reducing them down, so that I only needed like a word to remind me what the joke was. And that's what I did. And it was more like writing. If you were writing funny stuff for a television program or something like that, that's what I was doing. I wasn't really I could never do stand up where you stand up and actually entertain a room,
Did you feel obliged to be controversial in any way, or did you feel like obliged to fit any type of stereotype just so you get like a laugh or something, or just to be a little controversial?
I did. I mean, my natural inclination is to be a bit shocking, I suppose, anyway. And I interviewed a comedian called Jim Norton while I was preparing to go and do the stand-up as part of the feature. I interviewed a comedian called Jim Norton, and he gave me a horrific joke, so it wasn't my joke, but he said, "Oh, you should say this joke." So I said, "Okay, I'll try that." And I wouldn't have done it if I was a real comedian. I wouldn't have taken someone else's joke. But because I was writing for the piece and I included it in the piece, I thought that was reasonable. But it was a horrific joke. And I told it. And there was no need to do it because I was telling like funniest jokes and they were fine. And it went down fine, but I would reckon people must have been in the room just going, "What?" But it was a joke about something outrageous. But it also in the room, because it wasn't a normal show. When I got there, and I was going to tell some dodgy jokes anyway, and there was like a family with a baby in there, and I was like, "Oh my god, what am I going to do?" It was really bizarre. So like it's one of those things, when people do a best man speech. And then when they turn up to the wedding and they suddenly go, "Ooh, I forgot all these people were going to be here. It wasn't just a speech to my mates." And it felt like that. I was like, "Ooh," but I did it anyway just because I was going to write about it. So, yeah, it was fine. But I do have a recording of that 5 minutes of stand-up I did, but I will never put that in the public anywhere.
I thought it was public.
No way. No, I mean it's all. It just didn't look good. Yeah.
To be honest, I'm surprised you didn't perhaps include it in the book or as an article or a piece in of itself saying my 5 minutes of stand-up or something.
Well, this article that I wrote for British Airways, it was all about that. It was about me learning to do stand-up and then going and doing stand-up and stuff.
Oh, okay.
So it ended up being that, and the Independent syndicated that. So it went in the Independent as a feature. So it was on their front. It was on their page one actually, like flagged up on page one. So that was nice. But I didn't include it in the book because it was so long ago, and like I don't know. I didn't want the book to be about me when I was initially doing it, and then obviously that changed. But yeah. So it just felt like something different.
How did it feel being there and being in that scene then? Because I know you were doing a lot of interviews and you were sort of immersing yourself into the world of comedy, not only the owners, but the whole scene itself. So how did it feel being there, being in New York and actually, performing, but also being there as well?
Yeah, well, it was just that first time that I performed, and that was the last time I ever did that. Just generally, I think as a writer, it feels good to be in New York. When you're in New York and you're working, you're doing some work there. And there's a couple of times I've been over there for kind of features and stuff like that. And then also all through this book, I never lived in New York. I always lived in Newcastle, but I did quite a few trips over to New York for this book, and would hang around for a while. It just feels. In New York, you feel a tremendous sense of satisfaction as a writer. Like you've made it. Oh, this is me. I've made it. I'm doing well. I'm in New York. So there's that feeling anyway. And then to have at the Comedy Cellar, the owner, for some reason, I kind of get on with him. But for some reason, he just gave me amazing access to him and to his club. And, the comedians didn't necessarily want to speak to me a lot of the time. They were very difficult to get to talk. And some of them, they're just very careful about journalists. They don't know what you're going to write. They've been burned a lot of times. And they don't, the big thing is the comedians want control over their own story as well. I found that with so many of them. Lots of them were very angry about the book. Quite a few of them were very angry about the book, and I'm sure more were that I never heard about. They want control over their story. They want control over how they are presented. So that was difficult, but being in New York, writing about a New York club and having this tremendous access to this club and being able to speak to the owner of the club very candidly was tremendous. It was just like, oh no, I've got something here. I've got a story and I've got a way in. And it felt like something that I wasn't sure why New York writers weren't covering it so much in the way that I thought it should be covered.
I think it's one of those things where you're immersed in it every single day. It doesn't seem too, I don't know, appealing as much as if it's someone looking from the outside in. Yeah,
I think that's exactly it. It was a total. This book felt like something an outsider would write. Exactly. You parachute in every so often, have a look around, see what's happening, and you can spot the story much better than if you're there every day. You just miss the stories, I think. Yeah.
How did you just approach the owner and say to him, look, I just want to do a look at your the Comedy Cellar and your business and just have a look to see how it runs? Like, how did you pitch it to him?
Well, so the very first time I'd been in touch with him was back in like 2012, I think, when I wrote that piece for The Independent, and I got in touch with him, and that was a piece for British Airways in-flight magazine. So, that's just good publicity, you would have thought. It's not like I'm going to write something terribly controversial for British Airways in-flight magazine, which was a great magazine with great staff and stuff. But, it's kind of... So it was on safe ground there, I think. I wrote that, and then I wrote a couple of pieces about him and a couple of pieces about some of the comedians and stuff. And some of it, I think people weren't so happy about. I wrote a piece... for the FT Weekend magazine about him, and I just gradually got to know him over time. He knew sometimes I wrote stuff that he didn't like, so he knew that was a risk. But he also knew that I kind of liked the Comedy Cellar. I was very interested in the Comedy Cellar, so I think I did ask him about this. I said, and I nearly put it in the book. And I kind of feel like I should have done. But I said, why on earth are you like giving me this access and talking to me like this? Because I could just burn you, you know. And he said, "Oh, I know that you like the club, so it's like, He said, what could go wrong?" And I thought a lot of things could go wrong. There's very easily I could write stuff that he hated, and I did write one piece that he hated. So it's like for an article. So it's like, but regardless of that, he carried on giving me access, even when I've written stuff that he didn't like. So I thought that was fair on him.
He seemed like the type of guy, though, and I know part of the book and a big part of the book is his viewpoint on freedom of speech and how he goes about choosing guests. And even if a guest is controversial and they have said something controversial and he receives letters, he's very open to be like, we don't have a look at, what they say before they go on. And I'm not going to say anything if they say anything controversial because that stands against my principles. So he seems like a very principled guy towards how he runs the Comedy Cellar and for comedy in general.
Yeah, I think that's so. This owner, Noam Dorman, that is his thing, principle. I think that's why he gets so frustrated. He has a podcast now, and when he's talking on that, or when he's talking to the comedians in the club and stuff, it's all based on principle, and he gets frustrated that more people don't base their decisions on principle these days. It seems to be much more like, but this. My side is doing this, so it's okay, and that side is doing that, so that's bad, and vice versa. And his whole thing is principle. This is a principle, so even when it's difficult, I still want to stick to that principle. And he'll argue all through it, and there is a rationalism that comes in at times with him. I'm sure there are lines that he would draw about who he would allow in his. The obvious example is like Adolf Hitler. Would you let Adolf Hitler come into his, because he's got this comedy club and he's got this restaurant upstairs, would he let Adolf Hitler come in to eat in the restaurant? And he would have an interesting debate about, he's Jewish, he would have an interesting debate about that, whether he would allow him in or not, you know what I mean? Because he has this principle, which is, I'm not going to start saying you're allowed in, you're not allowed in, because then it all becomes about his feelings about that person, and he doesn't want to be the person who's stopping someone from entering a restaurant or so on.
Yeah, it's one of those things as well. Once you stop one person from coming in, where does it stop?
Exactly. Well, this is the thing, like with Twitter. So this person's banned from Twitter, this person's not banned from Twitter. Well, now Twitter has to make that decision again and again and again about who they're going to ban and who not going to ban. And I can see why you'd want to ban certain people, but once you've gone down that route, well, it becomes very difficult to keep on making that decision and keep justifying the decisions that you're making.
And is that one of the things he's very apprehensive to do? Because once you sort of stop one comedian from coming in, all comedians think, well, why should I go there if I can't say X or be honest as a comedian?
Yeah, exactly. So so there's some stuff in the book there where kind of audience members complain to him or the booker or someone at the club about who's on stage and the jokes that this comedian is making on stage. And his reply to them, and I've also got his replies to some of these people in there, or I talk to him in the conversations, or I talk to the audience members about it. But his response is, if I stopped that comedian from going on the stage and making that joke, then I have adopted the role of the censor, and I decide, who can say what and who can't say what. And at that point, it all becomes about his sensibility and what he thinks is funny and what he thinks is funny is not funny. And he wants it to be an audience response. If the audience is laughing, then that's okay. If the audience isn't laughing, then that's not okay. And that's how he books the club. Of course, if someone was going up there and saying, wildly anti-Semitic stuff or Islamophobic stuff, and the audience was laughing their heads off, I'm sure he might start to think, I don't want that person on my stage, really. But I haven't seen that happen yet, so...
It's interesting. From what I've heard from comedians, I don't know any comedians personally, but from what I've heard, it's all about the intent of the joke. Because sometimes when a joke comes from a comedic place and you can tell that the comedian is saying it in such a way that it's making light of a difficult situation, but doing it in a humorous way. Whereas you can tell when someone's doing it from a very malicious or is intent, his or her intent is just to be malicious and to be mean.
Well... this whole stuff is it feels very generational, doesn't it? Because for me, it was always about the intent, and comedians will say, comedians, particularly in a small club like this club is very famous now, and it's been on television and things like this, and talked about in a lot of places and interviews and stuff. But 15 years ago or so, it was called a workout room, because that's where comedians went to work out their material. A lot of comedians. The more famous comedians, and that's still where a lot of the comedians who are super famous go to work out material, like Louis C.K., Amy Schumer, Chris Rock, people like this, Dave Chappelle. They go to the Comedy Cellar and work out their material, and in working it out, sometimes you're going to get it wrong, and so that's, the intention was still to make people laugh, but they slightly got it wrong, and maybe people didn't laugh. But if the intention was there to make people laugh, then to me that joke is all right. You know what I mean? Nothing's off limits if someone was trying to get a laugh. If someone's being, well, Stuart Lee talks about this in the intro. Actually, sometimes jokes are intended to harm as well. It might not just be to make people laugh. It might be to make a point. It might be to kind of hurt someone else's feelings and stuff like that. Well, this is all part of it. And so, I think, if someone's going up there on stage and making people laugh, then that's the main criteria. But even as I'm saying that, though, I'm thinking about certain comedians who say things, like the P word and stuff. So I talk about that as well, like Bernard Manning and things like this. So it's like, and that's my whole worry about as soon as I started writing this book, I was like, would I have defended Bernard Manning going on stage and saying that stuff? And I don't know whether I would have done or not. And I'm certainly pleased if he's not in somewhere like the Comedy Cellar telling jokes like that, So it's really tricky. And I think when you get into trouble is when you make absolute rules on this sort of stuff. You have to give some leeway, you know what I mean? And you have a point of principle, and then when it gets to the very tricky cases, then you start having to think a little harder.
It's also the case, as someone who's a writer like yourself, you don't want to be saying to another person, or someone who is a comedian, or someone who creates content and tries to elicit a reaction, what they should say and what they shouldn't say, because then it kind of goes against the ideal of what it is that you do as well. So it becomes a judgment instead of a critique.
Well, I mean, that was the whole. I guess that was probably actually. I think I might have this in the book. I can't remember, but I think that was actually why I started writing the book, because of the way people were reacting to these comedians at the Comedy Cellar and trying to get them to not be allowed on stage anymore, or get them to stop saying the jokes that people didn't like. And I thought, I'm a writer, and I want to write what I want to write, and I know what kind of person I am, and I know my intentions, and I don't think I've ever written anything that was intended to. Divide people or was bigoted or anything like that. I don't want anyone to stop me from saying something because of a particular word I've used, or because, they've misunderstood what I've written, So, I think it's, as a writer, you kind of feel very defensive of comedians as well, I think. Yeah.
I think it's also this idea that you want people to say what they want to say, so that you give them the space to voice their true opinions. Because as soon as you tell someone that they can't say anything, or you ban them at all, and you see this with social media companies, you've automatically given the person who's banned all the power, because you say to them, well, you're not giving me a chance to say what I actually mean. And that is perhaps the most important thing of all.
Yeah. I kind of think so. So I was doing... I've been doing a PhD on creative writing, creative nonfiction, and for that I was watching. I went and attended, and I've been writing about these marches that were happening in Sunderland, and a lot of these people in these marches were Tommy Robinson supporters, and Tommy Robinson was up there sometimes on these marches as well. It was a very complicated situation, which I won't get into, but there's these marches happening, and so I read his book when I was doing this PhD. And he talks about in his book how when he started getting on the news and getting interviewed and getting a platform, as we say now, his support skyrocketed, and he's like, the organisation I had, the EDL, support for that skyrocketed when he started getting mainstream coverage. And when he was on Twitter, he has a huge following, And when he got taken off Twitter, I think that damaged his ability to operate enormously. So when I kind of make the argument for free speech that probably Twitter shouldn't be banning people and stuff like that, I always have in my mind that actually, on the other hand, Tommy Robinson was hugely enabled by being allowed to have a platform on social media and by it being interviewed on mainstream media and stuff like that. So that's and then you have to decide, well, is the cure worse than the, are we going to end up in a worse place if we start banning people, or are we going to end up in a better place? And I guess my feeling is that we'll probably end up in a much worse place if we ban people and stop people from being able to speak.
I think
go on.
It's a worse of two evils, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
It's like which evil do you choose? The one where you ban people, or the one that you let people speak?
Yeah, and obviously as a writer, and with many examples, particularly over the last 100 years or so, you think about when people are stopped from saying what they want to say, and you stop writers from saying things, and you stop people on stages from saying what they want to say. That's not an indication of a good society or a society heading in a good direction. I would have thought.
No. Yeah. That's a slippery slope right there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's a slippery slope.
So that's why my instinct, and with the instinct with this book, and it was real, passion with this book, was you've got to defend that. You've got to allow people to go on stage, and then if people don't want to hear it, they don't want to hear it. But you have to give people the ability to go on stage and say what they want within a room of people who have chosen to go and see that. That's the point.
See, that's why I thought you wouldn't have any comedians that would be against you writing the book. So it seemed strange to me when you said that some comedians weren't happy with you writing the book, even though I would have thought you're actually out there to defend them.
Yeah. No, it isn't. It wasn't about the argument of the book that they don't like. They don't. One of them. I was in New York a few weeks ago. One of the comedians. He said I made him sound like a whiny bitch, and he was having a big go at me. Like, I was in the Comedy Cellar because I went to see a show, and someone I knew who he was, so I didn't kind of flag myself up. But someone I was with, who worked at the Comedy Cellar, said, "Oh, you should meet Andrew. He wrote the book about this place." And I was like, "Oh God, here we go." And the guy started going off a little bit, and I just kind of listened to him have his little rant. And he was really cross, but I just thought, and he said, next time you write a book about it, get it right. And I thought, you've just complained for 2 minutes about in a book where you come across pretty well, to be honest. So I'm not sure I did get it wrong. It was like that. It was like I was saying earlier. It was all to do with control over their own image and their own words. That's what they were really worried about. And there was another one who got really annoyed, more justifiably, I think, who got quite annoyed, and he has a radio show, so I think it went on for a few days where he kept talking about this book during his radio show quite angrily, because he didn't like one of the customers kind of implied that he was a bigot, and I included that in there, and so he didn't like that. And I understood that, because it's like it could, nobody wants to be portrayed as that kind of thing, but his jokes were pretty out there, and I thought it was quite clear from the book that was just the audience member's point of view, and I didn't necessarily agree with that, and I think the stuff that I wrote in the book didn't agree with that, and I specifically said, I think the comedians were just trying to be funny when they went on stage. So in the book, but so that was the sort of stuff that they got annoyed about.
Do you get an indication from speaking to a lot of these comedians and the scene itself that comedians feel like they can say whatever they want and they're above the line, or that they are above everyone else in society because they have this position and they feel like they can say what they want to say?
The comedians, no, I think the comedians are generally pro-free speech across society and for everyone. I think the problem that the comedians have is they are used to overwhelmingly positive coverage over the past decade or so, where people who write about the comedy industry and comedians are just going and doing an interview, which then goes in like Time Out magazine or some glossy kind of publication, or like in the newspaper on a website, and it's just it's generally on their side, a bit of publicity. It's PR basically, and they're not used to being written about in a way which is more newsy, and I think that's what. And there is at least I know one journalist in America who's trying to change that, and he's trying to write about them as an industry and hold them to account as an industry. And so all through COVID and stuff, if they were doing shows that he thought like contravened the rules, he was writing about it and stuff, and that really annoyed a lot of them. And he was like, "But look, you're putting this stuff out there, so I'm gonna write about you as an industry and treat you like anyone does any other industry, And also, and he does the same with their work as well. So when they're telling jokes on stage, or when they're putting stuff out on podcasts and stuff, he responds to that with by scrutinizing it and then having his response to it. And I think they're not used to that as well. So I think with my book as well, I think they had a particular idea about what a book about the Comedy Cellar was going to be, and they thought it was going to be a book which is the Comedy Cellar is amazing. It's such a legendary place. There was some controversy, but it's all turned out good in the end. And that I'm not interested in writing a book like that. This book was about, these are really thorny issues. Let's get into them, and there might not be any answers. And you guys are I'm kind of slightly using the comedians to have these debates, but mainly with the owner. And he was fine with what I was doing. But I think they wanted it to be, the Comedy Cellar is a legendary place, and we are part of that story now because we perform here. And some of them, and that wasn't what I was writing. Some of them were, very much wanted to tackle some of the controversies like Louis C.K. and stuff like that. But yes, some of them I think had a particular idea about what a book about a comedy club was going to be, and it was different to their idea.
Do you think it was those that perhaps on the Ascension that felt very strongly about not having their image torn? Because I think that with comedians now, it's very much like comedy. Like, what's the ascension of comedy? From comedy you go to TV, or then you go to movies. So if anyone poses a roadblock in that line of ascension, then they want to shut you up.
Yeah, I mean, nobody tried to shut me up. Nobody said, "Oh, don't write this book" or anything like that. So, and people who I interviewed, I'm grateful to, because they gave their time to interview. It's just the book probably wasn't what they expected. But yeah, that's the really big thing in the comedy industry. I think is like, you're out there, you're telling all these jokes at clubs, and you're doing lots of podcasting because they do so many podcasts now, and there's so much material out there. And they were younger when they did some of it. They weren't successful when they did some of it. And then they're getting to the point where they're getting stuff on American television channels and things like Netflix and stuff like that. And then they want to get into films, and they want to be selling out theatres, and they want to be moving even some of the performance stadiums, So there's all that, but that all involves being picked out by industry people, saying, yes, you can be it, you can't be it, you can be it, you can't be it. And they're very, very hot. The comedians are very, very hot on ensuring that nothing jeopardizes them. Because all it takes now is somebody who's about to pick them for a Netflix special, does a quick Google and finds some controversy from 3 years ago where they said something, and it's, it might not be portrayed particularly fairly, and that's going to cost them huge opportunities. So I've got great sympathy for them with that, which is why I was trying to be so careful with my book, because it's like, I don't want my book to cost you opportunity unless you deserved it, but nobody did seem to deserve it. It's like, if they hadn't already lost those opportunities, that was part of the story. So, like, for example, Louis C.K. But it was basically, I think some of them were very, very worried about losing opportunities, and when you see every so often, like, there's a couple of comedians I know who get mentioned in the book. A rumor went around the internet, and so they just pulled down all of their Patreon podcasts and videos and everything, because they didn't want people trawling through it to look for things that they had said. So they just pulled it all down. And you see this, fairly regularly, where people just, Shane Gillis, he was a comedian. He's not in the book, but he performs at the Comedy Cellar now. And he was a comedian who used to do loads of podcasts, and he was going to be he was going to be on the Saturday Night Live cast, or I don't know, a writer on it or something. He was going to join Saturday Night Live, and then a journalist went through all his stuff, and found out this bit where it kind of sounded, he was kind of derogatory towards Chinese people, I think, or he put on accents or something like that. And so he lost that. He got ditched from Saturday Night Live, And that's the sort of thing that's going to hang over a person for the rest of their life, where they could have had this superstar status and then they lost it. And I think he's doing well now, but it's like, that's what they're all cautious about. It's like, if I'm going to have a big opportunity, what is in my past that's going to cost me that opportunity? And so, yeah, I was trying to be careful with my book. I didn't want to shy away from any subjects, but I also wanted to be fair with them. And I think you could do that in a book. You can be like, look, you said this controversial thing. Let's have a discussion about it. Oh, by the way, it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. That's totally fine. Whereas once it's on the internet, that's a different ball game, I think, because things get misrepresented and taken out of context and stuff.
Are a lot of comedians very wary of new media then, putting out their own type of media and then what people can say and can't say? Because I would have thought with the rise of podcasts and podcasting, they would be very careful. But I guess it also presents an opportunity for them as well to gain a new audience. And I think one comedian you mentioned in the book was Andrew Schultz, who used social media very well, last year to gain a following. And now he's, selling out theaters all over the country in the US. So are comedians scared to use that type of new media, or do you see most of them embracing it?
No, I see them all embracing it. They've all, most of the comedians that seem to be doing well have got podcasts, go on podcasts, have been on podcasts for many years now. They also, some of them couldn't get deals for their special. The special, just in case anyone listening, is like an hour-long performance that's recorded. We used to call it a special because they were kind of rare, but now they've all got them all the time.
Everyone.
So but some of them couldn't get their specials. Some of the younger guys couldn't get their specials on Netflix or HBO or some of those places. So they just put them on YouTube, and they get loads of clicks for that. And it kind of, and that gives them some money, but it also shows the industry that actually they've got a following and they're worth investing in. So I think they all embrace new media, but I think initially, when they started doing podcasts, certainly when I started listening to them, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, they were not very careful about what they were saying. And I think definitely over the last 3 or 4 years, you can hear all the hesitations as they're speaking on podcasts. You hear them stopping themselves. You hear when one of the more controversial comedians says something, a lot of them will drop out of the conversation, or they don't want to be involved in it because they're all so hyper aware that video, a lot of them are filmed now as well, the podcasts, that clip could be shown, it could be clipped and it could be put on the internet, and if they're there laughing about an off-color joke, then that could cost them a lot. So I think they're all hyper aware. As soon as there's something which could cause them trouble, they drop out of that conversation. And there's some who have, gone more in that Andrew Schultz direction, which is, look, I'm going to say what I want, but that's a gamble, That's like, I'm going to have to do it for myself because the industry isn't going to be with me for a bit. And the industry then, I think, Netflix was then on with Andrew Schultz, but I think for a while it was a risk. It's that decision, isn't it? It's like, do I do it full-hearted, or do I hang back and hope that the industry is going to pick me at some point? So, yeah.
It's one of those things that they're always going to pick you when you're successful because they've always got money to make.
Yeah, well, as long as you've not said anything too outrageous. And Andrew Schultz, like some people would say, some of the stuff he said is, totally outrageous, and he should not have. The same as Dave Chappelle. Oh, he should not have a special on Netflix, But yeah, they've been careful not to say anything that's too cancelable, I think.
But who gets to define that? I think that's the underlying thread throughout your whole book, is who gets to define what is cancelable, what is outrageous, what isn't outrageous. Because I could listen to a joke and find it absolutely hilarious, and you could listen to the same one and be tweeting 30 tweets like that lady was in the book that you put. I can't remember her name, but she put so many tweets out about this one joke that someone made. So like, who gets to decide? And did you perhaps had conversations about that topic? with comedians and with Noam as well?
I mean, there's some conversations with Noam there in the book, who gets to decide. And then I think I've got some stuff in there with comedians where we talk about it a little bit. In the comedy club, it's basically the owner of the comedy club, isn't it? He decides who's going to go on that stage and who's not. And if someone says something that they don't like, then they can stop booking him or her. That's the way that the comedy world works. Outside in the wider world, who gets to decide? Well, the problem is that it's not, we are all very aware now of if we say certain things in public, for example on Twitter, the reaction that it might have. So we just stop ourselves from saying them. So it's basically who decides what you can and can't say. Well, it's been the most heated and hysterical people, I think, have decided slightly. That whole thing that you talk about intent. It's like, so now if you said something with the correct intention, you could be making an anti-racist argument, but then if you used a particular word, you would be in a lot of trouble, and that kind of trouble is very, very stressful and can cost you an awful lot. Even if your intention was the right intention. So who decides what people can and can't say? Well, it was the most easily offended, and it was the and then some people, lots of people will make the argument to me, like, oh, you can still say what you like. Yeah, you can, and people say, well, and there's just what do they say? It's not cancel culture; it's consequences culture.
100%.
Yeah, but like, I don't know. Like, I think the consequences are too severe, and I think people are misrepresented. And I think it has stopped people from saying what they want to say, and not that people want to say, like, that's the other thing. So, well, what did you want to say? And it's like, well, nothing bad. I just want to talk about this stuff, and even saying something like that makes me sound like some kind of fool, but hopefully people understand what I mean. Which is just this worry that at any point you might be filmed, things that you say might be, plucked and put on the internet and cause you a lot of problems. Like that John Ronson book,
Yeah, like, and I think another thing that you said in the book, and I can't remember who said this in the book, but it said that something along the lines of like the best comedians are philosophical contrarians, but at the moment they feel like they can't say what they want because they're too scared to voice their true opinions. And I thought it was interesting because I see comedians as like medieval jokers. So they go to the court and they make these jokes, and they might make a slip of the tongue and make a joke about the king, and they're towing the fine line between getting the king or the queen to laugh or getting their head chopped off. Yeah. Like I that's where I see comedians like those royal jesters. I don't know whether they see themselves as that way, but me as someone who observes them sees them as towing that line.
Yeah. So I think that is what they're doing. And so in order to toe that line, sometimes you go over it. So, but the consequences used to be, so somebody was doing a set in a club or in a theatre, the consequence used to be they would get booed in that room, or there would be silence in that room, or someone would shout something in that room. But now the consequence can be, which Stuart Lee talks about in the intro, is someone films that and then puts it on the internet. And then that person, might not get the TV deal that they were hoping for, or they might not get invited on a panel show that they were hoping for, or that maybe some theatres aren't going to hire them anymore. And it's the same with, if they go on television and they say something, 2005, they said something on TV, that it used to disappear, but now it's around forever, and it gets brought back up in a time when it wasn't said. And it can cause them consequences then as well. And also the consequences that used to be, so say protests outside the BBC, for example, which happened to Stuart Lee, people phoning up, death threats and stuff like that. but that was a kind of you could confront that, but now it spreads all over the internet, and you can't confront every single person. You can't argue against every single person. So your reputation is just tarnished online by people saying, he said this joke, therefore he is a something, and some kind of a bigot, and it kind of I just think that whole system is set up to stop people from saying things. So I think you'll find like younger comedians now will like make sure that they don't say some of the jokes that they would have otherwise have said, because they know that because they've learned now that it'll exist forever and it could be brought up in the future and it could cost them opportunities. So, and you might say, well, that's good because we don't want people saying this sort of stuff. But I kind of really like, take Stuart Lee, Jerry Springer the Opera, it's really good, powerful stuff, but people wanted that cancelled back then. And it's like, you want provocative stuff. You don't want bigoted stuff. You want provocative stuff. And that can come in all different forms, but people are just going to shy away from it because it's too risky. It's not worth the hassle. If you want a nice career in comedy, just don't say anything bad. Don't say anything that's going to get you in trouble.
But don't you think that's not comedy then? Because from what you've just said, then what will be the state of comedy in 5, 10, 20 years if people aren't allowed to say what they want to say?
Well, it is comedy. It's just not comedy I'm particularly interested in. Like, but that is the thing. Like, this happens in entertainment as well, though, I think. Like, so I remember I was born in 1980, and in the 1980s and early 90s, I found, oh god, like radio DJs were so boring and so nice and so just cheesy. And then in the mid 90s, it changed, and suddenly you had the radio DJs and TV presenters and stuff who were doing they just seemed a bit more real and authentic, and you would felt like you were seeing behind the scenes bit, even if it was just a presentation that they wanted to give you, and that was exciting. And now it feels like that's gone back to being just kind of careful and nice. I listen to Radio 1 sometimes now because of my kids, and it's like, oh, really, I don't find it tricky. But I feel like the same thing is kind of happening with comedy a bit, or has happened with comedy a bit, where a lot of people quite reasonably, I don't blame them, are being very, and it's happening in publishing as well, are being very, very careful about what they say and what might be in their back catalogue, So with comedy, I don't like a lot of comedy. I'm very specific about the comedians that I like. Otherwise, I'd just sit there and be in a comedy club watching someone that I don't find funny at all, and nobody wants that because it's awkward for me and it's awkward for them. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a massive follower of comedy at the moment because, I mean, the last time I watched something, I think, was my uncle told me to watch the stand-up special that Eddie Murphy did, where he wore the leather tracksuit. I'm just trying to remember what the name of it was now. It's really famous.
Raw?
But
Delirious?
Sorry?
Raw?
Delirious, that was the one.
Yeah.
I think it was Delirious.
Yeah.
And I thought, holy crap, you can't say that now. I was like, imagine if he came out with a leather tracksuit in 2022 and started saying all those things.
Yeah. Well, I think some of the stuff that Eddie Murphy said, about gay men that he was saying back then, was, I think it was, it was upsetting for people at the time, and I think he might have gotten some bother for it at the time. So that's a perfectly good example of should you said this sort of stuff? You know what I mean? Was it divisive? Was it, did that cause people grief in their life? Did it kind of say that saying this word is acceptable, talking about gay men is acceptable like this? So that's a really interesting debate. That's exactly the sort of thing that I wanted to get into in the book, which I hopefully did, because it's not clear cut to me. Those two specials are amazingly funny. But if you were doing it now, would you say, well, just don't do those jokes? I think Eddie Murphy would feel the same. You just wouldn't do those, might do those, would do those.
The interesting thing as well is look at the career he had afterwards. He became the donkey in Shrek. I mean, he definitely
Yeah.
become a donkey in Shrek. He made one of the most popular cartoons I think ever created. I don't know how much it is in box office, but I mean, we only watched it a couple of weeks ago, over Christmas. So,
Mm.
I mean, there is no chance if someone came out like Eddie Murphy did back then, now that they would be anywhere close to as successful as he was.
Yeah, so that's to me, that's the shame, is that so he's still got a successful career, but he said things when he was younger which he wouldn't say now. He's learned, and it's like and because became hugely successful, he kind of got away with it. So my worry is that are we forgiving enough of people when they've I believe we're clearly not forgiving of people when they've said stuff in their past, do we give them a route out of it, or do we just say horrible things about them on the internet and watch their life fall to bits? All of this, it all comes back to me to the John Ronson book. You've been publicly shamed, because that's what it's to me. I just feel the consequences for errors, and sometimes errors in the past, are far too severe.
You think the consequences are too high for someone who gets called out in public and shamed?
Yeah, I think so.
With their life falling apart, right in front of them.
Yeah, I mean, even just getting into a small heated exchange on Twitter is stressful, and can it makes you flush and ruins your day and stuff like that. So to have people around the world saying horrible things about you, and then knowing that your employers are going to be doing something about it, that future employers are going to be doing something about it. This happened with Noam, Dorman, the owner of the Comedy Cellar, in the book, because Louis C.K. had the New York Times had written a story about what he'd been doing, and he'd admitted that they were correct, that he had been doing this stuff, and then Noam allowed him to go back on the stage afterwards. So Noam got loads of flack for that, and he was talking about his stomach acid going all the time and stuff, and how stressful it was trying to deal with that. So that's I find that really interesting. Like, someone who is under the global spotlight, where literally, like, New York Times, BBC, Hollywood Reporter, or The Guardian, all these places around the world were writing about his club and his decision, and and then all these people, and that's kind of reasonable, because that's most of those things are written by reasonable people and edited by reasonable people. But then you get all the people who are then on social media who jump on it and say horrible things, and someone threatening to firebomb his club and stuff like this, and you're like, come on, guys, you can argue against the decision and you can think horrible thoughts about him, but you don't need to be putting all this stuff written in the public. I'm talking about social media there, but
yeah, I know you are, and this is me with my point of view on this subject. I feel like they have used the ability to, whether you call it cancel culture or consequence culture, they have used the current ecosystem as an excuse to go after people because they hold a certain status or certain position in society, and perhaps they just want to see the world or someone who is successful taken down, because they feel like they can. Like, I don't know how many people approach it from a good-hearted, this has offended me, sort of, please rethink it, or how many people just come from it, I just want to take you down because I feel like I can because you said this.
Yeah, and I'm always kind of careful to separate that. If we're talking about that, then now separate it from what Louis C.K. did, because Louis C.K. actually did something and he admitted to it, so we know he did it. So and that was to do with. I always use the term that New York Times used just for legal reasons, but sexual misconduct, because they've got good lawyers.
You want to be as careful as possible, Andrew.
Yeah. So I separate. So that discussion is kind of separate to that one. But yeah, do people just want to bring people down? Yeah, of course they do. That's part of human nature, isn't it? When someone's successful, if you can, lots of people want to pull people down a little bit. Yeah. And then also there's a righteousness that comes along, and then there's also a mob mentality that comes along, and yeah. On the other hand, I'm too soft, and so to me, I'd be, there'd be anytime someone does something wrong in life, to me, it would be like, you did something wrong. Are you sorry? And they'd go, yeah, I'm sorry. And I'd go, okay, then go on, carry on. I'm exaggerating, but that so sometimes I'm in court for crimes as a journalist, and I'm not a defendant. I'm there in the press box. And I always just feel sorry for the people who are getting sentenced and stuff, and I find it very difficult to look people in the eyes, the defendants, as they're being sentenced and stuff. And these are people who, some people have killed people and things like this, done terrible stuff. But I find it very difficult watching people being punished, because it just feels so like they have no control at that point. And even if it is justified, it feels cruel in some way. So that's always my feeling when I go into these things. So I admit that I'm probably too soft and probably, would not be a good judge in the social media justice world. But yeah.
Yeah, probably not. I wouldn't be as well, to be fair, because I don't partake in anything like that. I just think it's I to call it a waste of time, I think is a bit wrong, because I don't think it's a waste of time. I think that there are better uses, or there's better places that can be changed rather than on social media. I'm all for having discussions. That's why I love having a podcast, and I love, long form discussions, because I think you can work things out, but, I grew up in the UK where, being Muslim and being ethnic, you get things said to you, but at the end of the day, you have a bit of a laugh about it and you move on. No one does it. To be honest, no one's done it out of malice to me, but at the end of the day, it's one of those things that the more you react to it, the worse that someone pokes you. That's what I've found. If you just laugh it off, it usually just subsides.
Seeing, I'm not sure about that. Some of the stuff I was doing for that PhD, they were really there was Tommy Robinson supporters, but there were, there was some people got beaten up and things like this, and some of the stuff. I don't know. I think Islamophobia is a big problem, but that we do need to figure out and do something about it. And I think it's only going to be a growing problem. But
That's a conversation for another day, Andrew.
It's
a conversation for another day.
You know what though? It's kind of part of the same conversation, because so one of the guys I was writing about in this PhD. He went to prison for 21. He got sentenced to 21 months for stirring up racial hatred, and that was because he was making these speeches that he was making in Sunderland. So it's a free speech thing, And I was really shocked. And his speeches were not nice, and they, but he wasn't being. There was no link from these speeches to violence. At least he wasn't being prosecuted for any speeches that he made which were linked to violence. Or he didn't get found guilty of any speeches that linked to violence. But he went to jail for 21 months for making these speeches. And I thought, wow, that's quite something in the UK or in England that we're doing that, sending someone to prison for making speeches that hadn't led to any violence. Yeah.
But what was he saying? Like, how bad were the speeches? If they weren't inciting violence, were they just against a certain...
Stirring up racial hatred is the crime. And I think you can get sentenced for up to 7 years for that. So stirring up racial hatred, it doesn't need to be inciting violence. It's stirring up racial hatred. Yeah.
And does that make its way onto the internet as well? If you incite that on the internet as well, can you get prosecuted?
Yes.
Interesting.
Are you worried?
Well, I don't do anything. I share books online. That's all I talk about. I'm very careful about what I say. I'm very careful.
This was. You remember David? What's his name? David Starkey, that historian who said some stupid stuff, racist stuff. And he was on Darren Grimes' podcast, and that I think it was the same. The police were investigating for the same thing, which is stirring up racial hatred. And so you could be the person making the speech, but also if you broadcast or publish it, you can be up on the same crime.
No, definitely. Yeah, I think that's something that I'm very... Well, to be honest, I try and stay as least controversial as possible, even with the authors that I get on and the people that I speak to, because my thing's not about being controversial. That's not... some people like to be controversial for the sake of being controversial.
Yeah. It's too stressful.
It's way too stressful. It's something that I want to avoid.
If someone was paying me a lot of money to do it, but
no, I think even with the money, Andrew, the stress, I don't think it's worth the stress.
No, you're right.
Easy life.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and discussing your book, Don't Applaud, Either Laugh or Don't, at the Comedy Cellar. Books here. Where's the best place that people can find you online or social media, Andrew?
I don't offer much, but I'm on Twitter at Andrew Hankinson, and my website is www.andrewhankinson.com. And my book is available at Bookshop or Amazon. You might struggle to find it in shops now, but it's online. You can buy it.
Perfect. Thanks so much for coming on, Andrew.
No, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. Hopefully you took away some interesting thought points from this podcast regarding comedy and the role that comedy plays in modern day society. It was an interesting conversation and one that I was really looking forward to share, actually, because it was quite comedic, funny enough, at times during the podcast. So you can purchase Andrew's book in the description below, and you can also check out his website as well. I've put the link in the description below as well if you want to go check out his other books and potentially buy the book as well. Thank you again for listening to this podcast. Just a reminder, if you haven't already subscribed, please do. Each week we send out a podcast with an author to discuss their book and the ideas and principles inside of them. Thanks again for listening to this podcast, and I'll see you in the next one.